Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's June 1st, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're looking at Indigenous people's long relationship with and stewardship of marine environments. Coastal cultures have often enjoyed abundant lifestyles thanks to the wide array of food, fiber, and other useful resources provided by the world's seas, sounds, estuaries, and oceans. Indigenous peoples have also developed strong marine conservation traditions and ingenious methods of ensuring sustainable long-term harvests through practices like aquaculture. And on this episode of the Manga Bay Newscast, we'll look at two examples of this kind of aquaculture. We speak today with Nicola MacDonald about a project in New Zealand that aims to replace the plastic ropes used by mussel farmers with more sustainable alternatives. MacDonald tells us about how the project is based on traditional Maori knowledge being used in conjunction with Western science. I don't want to butcher the name of her people or the organizations she works with, so here's Nicola MacDonald introducing herself.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Nicola MacDonald. I am a descendant of Ngāti Rehua, Ngāti Wai, which are the Indigenous peoples of Te Moana Nui o Toi, the Hauraki Gulf, and I am also the inaugural co-chair of the Hauraki Gulf Forum and the chair of the Auckland Conservation Board and the chair of the Aotea Conservation Park.
We also speak today with Dana Lepofsky, a professor in the archaeology department at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada. Lepofsky tells us about her research into clam gardens on the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, some of which have been found to be as much as 3,500 years old. But these clam gardens are such a reliable and sustainable source of food that there's a movement afoot today to rebuild them, Lepofsky tells us.
Indigenous people up and down the coast have started their own clam garden restoration projects, and there's some just unbelievably groundbreaking and inspiring projects that are all community-led. They're focused on clam gardens and the rebuilding of clam gardens with youth and tracking the abundance of clams once clam gardens have been rebuilt and refurbished and tilled and cleaned. And it's, to be honest, the most inspiring movement that I've been part of in my entire career. I'm just so privileged to witness it.
As you can read about in a recent interview with Nicola MacDonald published by Manga Bay, which we'll link to in the show notes for this episode, green-lipped mussels are endemic to Aotearoa, the Maori name for New Zealand. The mussels grow in the wild, but as New Zealand-based journalist Monica Evans wrote for Manga Bay, they're also farmed on floating lines in many of the country's calmer bays and harbors. This is an example of aquaculture that provides a large amount of nutrient-rich animal protein for human consumption, and it has a relatively small carbon and freshwater footprint. But there is one sustainability challenge presented by green-lipped mussel farms. They are responsible for a large amount of plastic waste. Plastic ropes are usually used to catch wild mussel larvae, known as spat, and these ropes can end up contributing to the problem of plastic waste choking our oceans, so much so that more and more forms of ocean life have been found to have microplastics inside their digestive tracts. Even us humans have been found to be consuming microplastics as a result of this abundant plastic waste. Nicola MacDonald is part of an effort to find a plant-based alternative to these plastic ropes. Western science is being applied to the problem, but it's equally informed by the traditional knowledge of MacDonald's Maori heritage. I asked MacDonald to tell us about her people and how long they've been living in their particular part of New Zealand.
Well, Ngāti Rehua is a tribe that come from a place called Aotea, which is the Great Barrier Island, which is one of the furthest outer islands of the Hauraki Gulf. And Ngāti Wai is a larger tribe that covers the traditional areas of, in the far north, a place called Whangarei, all the way down to Tamaki, which is known as Auckland today. My people, and I descend from a sea-going coastal people, have maintained our exclusive occupation of our islands, of our whenua, which is our lands, since the 14th century. I descend from a tūpuna, an ancestor, and his name was Rehua. And Rehua came from a place called Kāwhia, which is on the west coast of New Zealand. And through many conquests and battles, Rehua maintained his chieftainship from the 17th century onwards, and I am a direct descendant to that tūpuna. Today, Ngāti Rehua and Ngāti Wai people continue to occupy all of our islands. Our relationship to the sea is one and the same as the relationship that we have to the land. There is no differentiation in our minds to whenua, which is land, moana, which is the sea. It contains the same life force, the Maori, and our role as descendants is to have stewardship, to tiaki, to look after the whenua, the land, and the moana.
I want to ask about your people's conservation traditions or ethics, but I know that for many Indigenous people I've spoken to on this podcast, there's not really a distinct thing called conservation in their worldview. Rather, being good stewards of the environment is just part of their way of life, intrinsic to the way they view the world and humanity's place in it. Would you say your people have conservation traditions, or is it just part of how you've always lived?
That's a really good question. I think the first context that we've got to understand with Te iwi Māori, with the Indigenous people of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, is we look at te taiao, which is the natural world, in terms of those universal obligations that we have. So the part of our belief systems are that the world, the universe, the seas, the lands represent the divine beings. So when we think of the whenua itself, we think of our atua, our gods, in this case, Papa Tuanuku. She is the embodiment in many ways of, say, perhaps Mother Earth. Above her is her husband, Ranginui, the Sky Father, and between them, through their union, are their children, which are all the demigods. So for the forests and all the bird life, the trees, the mountains, they belong to the care and stewardship of the atua Tane Mahuta. For the seas and all the animals that live within the sea, the water itself, all of the seaweed and the grasses, everything with the ocean belongs to the atua Tangaroa. And so for Te iwi Māori, when we consider our role in conservation, we consider that to be that we are the kaitiaki, we are the stewards to look after and entrusted to look after those atua and the children within that domain.
Can you tell us about this project, which is known as Corehunga Kutai, which aims to replace the plastic ropes used by mussel farms? How did it come about, and what are its goals?
Well, Kōhanga Kūtai has come about as a result of a serious need in New Zealand, which is to support mussel spat. So Kōhanga, I'll just talk about the name first. Kōhanga means a nest, in the same way that it's a nest for birds, and Kūtai is mussels. So when we think about this is Kōhanga Kūtai together is around looking at a nursery to support mussels, and in this case to support mussel spat, because what we know is that our modern day practices where we're using plastic ropes are a contributor to plastic pollutions and microplastics, and we think that there's possibly another way of actually reducing that impact by using Mataranga Maori. And Mataranga Maori is using ancient knowledge handed down from the time of the atua, from the time of the gods. So in this case, a partnership was formed by our iwi, which is Ngāti Manuhiri, and the University of Auckland, the Marine Institute, to bring together Western science and Mataranga Maori as a way of looking at how we can support mussel spat, the growth of mussel spat, and also reduce the impact of plastic pollutions.
So you're looking at a variety of plants to see if they can be used in place of the plastic ropes. Can you tell us about that research and how it's being conducted?
Well, absolutely. So one of the things with Mataranga Maori is we take a whole of community approach. So at one level, it's around looking at swapping plastics for a natural fibre. So that's really at an output level. But prior to that, there's a whole process, which we would call a kaupapa, that involves a whole village, a whole kāinga. And that includes the engagement of kaumātua, of elders. It includes the engagement of kairaranga, which are weavers, master weavers. It includes the engagement of kairungoa, which are those that are masters at botanicals and pharmacology in a Māori sense. And what happens is that we have our hui hui, which is our intensive workshops held on the land to discuss what fibres should be used. Māori believe, and we believe, every plant has its own whakapapa. It has its own genealogy, and we must respect the genealogy of that plant and their connection to the atua, the connection that they have to the gods. So it's not a case of going to the garden centre and saying that plant looks fine, that plant looks fine. It's actually an entire process, an Indigenous practice and customs that look at the time of the season to harvest, that looks at the whakapapa of this plant, that ensures that the karakia, the prayers given, the reverence is given to that plant to perhaps be a source that can address these modern day issues. So what we're looking at is we're looking at ancient customs to address the modern day hara, the modern day sins that we're facing in the 21st century. Now, part of our process is with our kaumātua, our elders, our master weavers, our master rongoas. We look for the right maramataka, which is a Māori calendar, and we're looking for the right seasons in which is the most appropriate time to go into the forest. We never just show up and say we're going to take this and take that. Everything must be done to celestial charts. So right now, we're in New Zealand, we're coming up to Matariki, which is our equivalent to a new year. And Matariki represents the 7 stars, the 7 sisters. And it is a time for us to look at reflection and in the forest to look at what plants and seeds are ready for harvest. So part of our process is to use the maramataka, the Māori calendar, find the right time to go. We always head out at dawn. We have our ancient karakia at dawn with all of our kaumātua, and then we move into the forest quietly and begin the prayers. And each plant that we have selected, and we selected over 12, we have blessed those plants, and then we have begun the process of preparing the plants for testing. So you can see just by that description, we haven't even got to, are we ready to now check and put these plants in the sea? So the Māori way of doing things, our Mataranga Maori, our ancient customs and knowledge, takes a whole of ecological, cultural, worldview before we even begin into the science of testing.
You mentioned earlier that the purpose of this project was to combine Mataranga Maori, this traditional Maori knowledge, with Western science. Have there been any particular challenges in utilizing both approaches or particular strengths?
Well, I think at the very outset, it's really important when Indigenous peoples engage with Western science that we're really clear around our expectations. We are not necessarily working against a research deadline or time frames. So that's really important around managing our expectations, because for Māori, because we're using Indigenous plants, which we call our taonga, our gifts, we work in the cycle of the natural world, which sometimes doesn't quite fit our very busy modern day lives. So a challenge is and will always present itself as to how clear each party is around expectations, and being patient and understanding that we each work on different models. A Mataranga Maori model does not become absorbed by Western science. They run parallel to each other. Each have their own equal weighting of responsibility and for ourselves, so too is the responsibility of upholding the mana, the authorities of who we are as the iwi, as the tribe, and our responsibilities to the atua. So that's one of the key challenges that actually becomes an opportunity. It starts off as a challenge because we have to iron out our expectations, but in the end, it becomes a wonderful opportunity for learning and growing awareness and strengthening our knowledge of both Indigenous customs and also of how Western science can complement those customs. And I think that's been one of the great opportunities that we've seen in Corehunga Kutai, is that once we've harvested, as I mentioned, we had 12 plants. Some of them needed to be, and they're not all sitting in one forest. That's the other thing, is that we've had to traverse our entire territories, which we call our rohe, and all of our ngaheres, our forests, for different plants. Not all plants grow in the same grove. So for us, some of those plants have been underwater reeds, which meant we had to dive for them in freshwater lakes, and you can only harvest those at a certain time in the year. So we've had to collect those plants properly. Other plants have been where you actually have to climb up the trees and harvest. They harvest from the top of the trees, and those plants are plants which we call tikoka, which are the cabbage tree. The underwater plants that I spoke about are called kuta, which is underwater reeds. Then we've harvested harakeke, which is like a flax, very common in New Zealand, but the flax is over in our territories. We have 20 varieties of flax, and the flax that we were particularly looking for is a very prized flax called Kōhanga, which is used. We extract the fibre from it, and it reveals a very silky thread. And so we wanted to see how Kōhanga would stand up. So all of these things, the way in which we harvest, have been a learning for our research partners. Equally, the way in which they've used the fibres in the scientific labs have been a learning for us as well. And it's been absolutely fascinating.
And are any of these plants proving to be the most promising in terms of replacing the plastic ropes?
Yes, well, we have, of the 12, we tested 3, and 2 of them are Indigenous taonga, and one of them is actually a pest plant, which is an invasive pest plant. And we really wanted to see from that particular plant, which we call pampas grass. It's an invasive pest plant that's right across our coastlines. Would this plant be suitable for perhaps something for good, something that we could reuse? So we've looked at pampas, and the other 2 that we've looked at was tikoka and harakeke. And both of them are proving to be quite good. The pampas is a little bit brittle. So what I'll do is I'll just describe the process of how we prepare these. So tikoka and harakeke are a long fibrous plant. And using mussel shells, our weavers strip back all of the fleshy parts of the plant. And underneath that plant is like a silken thread. It's like silk. And that is the thread that we use, and we do a process which we call hapene, which is to shred and shred and shred with a mussel shell so that it becomes like fine fluff. And so we tie that up, and then with the pampas grass, the stalks are quite brittle. And so we've been looking at how we can make this more like cotton wool, so that the tiny little mussel spats, when they're swimming through the water, they can latch on to those, to the floating threads. And what we're finding is that tikoka and harakeke, the mussel spat seems to latch on very well.
Once you've established the best option for replacing the plastic ropes, what are the prospects of it quickly being adopted? Is there a readiness in the community to adopt more sustainable alternatives?
Well, what we know in New Zealand is that microplastics are an absolute issue and a huge contributor to plastic pollutions in the moana and the oceans. We know that from recent research that Our tohora, which are the whales, ingest over 3 million microplastics every day. And so anything that can reduce that impact, Māori and non-Māori communities are absolutely passionate about. We've come through a global pandemic, and I think with that, it brings a different approach for how people view work and life. If this research project shows that using fibres, creating fibrous ropes for a mussel industry, which is a huge industry in New Zealand, is a better alternative to plastic pollutions, but can also provide a rebuilding and re-strengthening of customary skills such as preparing the forest, the harvesting, the preparation as weavers, then there are many, many more benefits to pursue this as a viable economic option, absolutely, an environmental option, and a cultural option.
Any final thoughts about all of this that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think one of the things that I'd like to share with our listeners is for Te iwi Māori, when we look at the ocean, and this particular ocean is called Te Moana Nui o Toi. Te Moana Nui means the great ocean of Toi, and it's T-O-I. And Toi was a renowned navigator of Māori people, of Māori tribes right across our country. The name Hauraki Gulf, its traditional name is Te Moana Nui o Toi, the great oceans of Toi. We believe that the ocean itself has its own mauri, and the mauri is a life force that connects all the islands, the tohora, the whales, the te whairahi, the stingrays, the takoketais, the sea petrels, the ika, the fish, the rimu-rimus, the seaweeds, all are connected to ourselves as tangata, the people, to te taiao, the natural world. If we do not look after the mauri, the life force, then it diminishes before us. And when it diminishes, the life force of all those tamariki, all those children that belong to the atua, tangaroa, also diminish. So our role is to be kaitiaki, to be stewards and guardians. And we have a saying, which is like a proverb, and it says, hei te aki e te whenua, look after the lands. Hei te aki e te moana, look after the oceans. Hei te aki, nā tamariki, nā mokopuna, look after the children and the future generations. He kai te aki koe, you are a guardian. He kai te aki o, I am a guardian. Kia ora.
Now we turn to my conversation with Simon Fraser University's Dana Lepofsky, an archaeology professor who studies the long-term development of indigenous marine management practices. Specifically, her recent research has looked at clam gardens on the coast of British Columbia. I asked her how she got into studying this sustainable and ancient tradition in North America's Pacific Northwest.
My interest in clams developed from my interest in herring. And my interest in herring just developed from being guided and taught by my Indigenous colleagues and friends about what was important to them. I'm actually a plant person, a paleoethnobotanist, so it means I study human-plant relationships in the past. And it was really, that's how we as academics kind of divide up the world. We study plants versus animals. We study this scale versus that scale. And really for Indigenous people or any local peoples who live on with the land and the sea, those divisions are kind of silly. So of course, people were teaching me about all kinds of things. And so I started with really thinking about herring in a big way. I was thinking about all resources before then, but really in a focused way about herring when I was working in an archaeological site and realizing from my own experience and then when the elders were talking to me that we were finding, hundreds of thousands of herring bones. And the elder said, yeah, so why is Departments of Fisheries and Oceans telling us that there were no herring here in the past? And the fact that there are none today is just, natural ups and downs of the herring abundance. And I literally remember looking up from my excavation and saying, yeah, where are the herring? And so that took me down a path of kind of co-coordinating the herring school with Indigenous people up and down the coast to basically promote, understand the importance of herring in the deep time past and how it differs today. And that includes management of the fish stock. So we think of the Northwest Coast as being really abundant in all resources, and, people could live here just willy-nilly over the millennia. But not true. Humans are really good at depleting resources if we so choose. We are fully able to do so. And herring, salmon, clams, all those things that people depended on were heavily managed. So herring was managed through transplanting and habitat creation, through tenure systems of who could harvest when and the like. And so too for plants, and then so too for clams. So really, I've been immersed in this world of traditional resource management, ecological knowledge, again, being guided by my Indigenous collaborators, friends, mentors, elders. And clam gardens was just kind of the next step, because I was working with people, knowledge holders, especially Kwāksistala Wathla, who's now passed, Chief Adam Dick, who's Kwakwak, and Adam was one of the few people alive who actually worked clam gardens when he was young and knew a lot about them. So my friend Nancy Turner introduced me to Adam, and Adam and I became fast friends, and I miss him just so profoundly. And Adam shared some of his knowledge with me, and that's kind of how it started. And at the same time, Adam had been sharing with other archaeologists, and archaeologists were having this awakening about the importance of clams and clam gardens and clam cultivation. There was this dogma that really was all about salmon before. We were slowly chipping away with that by recognizing the importance of plants and plant cultivation and herring management. But really, clams were just seen as kind of like a unimportant food and just kind of by the by, even though some of the middens here are like, 5 meters tall of shells, clam shells. People said, yeah, they're important, but they were really not so important relative to the other species, and it's because they were abundant. But of course, you can overharvest clams very easily, as we see today. So through Adam's guidance, a bunch of archaeologists and other people, other Western scientists, started realizing that this was an important thing to be recognizing, and it meant a lot for Indigenous people because it's tangible evidence of management of the foreshore. Whereas some of these other management practices like transplanting, tilling, tenure controls are harder to track in the paleoecological and archaeological records. So clam gardens all of a sudden presented something that was in people's faces. They couldn't deny that people were managing clams up and down the coast. And at the beginning, we didn't know how widespread and we didn't know how old, but we understood as Western scientists that it was really important. But Indigenous people have known this all along. It was like, yeah, of course. So it was really just about our awakening, and I was part of that awakening, being guided by many, many people.
So you co-authored a paper that came out in 2019 that determined clam gardens have been in use there for 3,500 years, which is a really remarkably long time to be managing a resource like that. Would you explain to us what exactly clam gardens are, how they're constructed, why they're difficult to date, and how you overcame that, and why it's important to determine when they were constructed?
Absolutely. So I'm going to step back a bit and just remind everybody that clam gardens are wonderful because they are tangible evidence of past traditional marine management systems. But those systems include a whole range of other things that we can't track that would be equally important and really important to understand going forward if we're thinking about using these methods. And so there are some things like that are actually actions, like I said, tilling or weeding or restriction of sizes and, restrictions of places you could go. There's all kind of social meaning, social relations that are embedded in traditional management systems as well. So it's your relationship to the clams and the history of your relationship to that place and your relationship to the other people who have access to those places, the songs and the stories that go with it. All that is embedded, intertwined with the management systems. So when we think about the clam garden that happens to have a rock wall that we as Western scientists can study, we need to remember, we need to imagine in our mind's eye the fullness of what it means to be cultivating clams. It's not just building this gardens, but the gardens are way cool. Like that's hands down way cool. So basically, really, clam gardens involve terracing the foreshore to change the slope of the beach. And terracing, of course, is a very common worldwide cultivation practice. You think of the agricultural terraces that many listeners will be familiar with. You know, you think of them on a slope on hillsides of places you traveled, or even your own garden. If there's a slope, you build a rock wall or some kind of barricade so that the sediment and the soil accumulate behind the terrace, level it out. It's less subject to erosion, and it's more subject to accumulation of good stuff. On ground is good stuff, rich nutrients where plants can flourish. And on the sea, it's the same for clams. So if you could see me, you would see that I was showing you a natural slope of a beach, an angle of the beach. And if any of you have played in the intertidal in places where there's large tides, like on the East Coast and West Coast of the US and Canada, you know that there are certain critters that hang out at different tidal zones. So as you're playing on the beach and walking down the beach, you know, there's some clams up higher, some clams midway, some kind of seaweeds at different zones. And it has to do with the relationship of, you know, water to exposure to being inundated by the sea and substrate. So imagine again this sloping beach with the natural zonation of the different critters. And imagine also that there's going to be a sweet spot where butter clams and little neck clams, the two most highly sought clams. So if you can imagine the zones of the zonation with the butters and little neck clams, butter clams and little neck clams being at some kind of sweet spot where they thrive best. So imagine that. Imagine that Indigenous peoples rolled rocks to clear the beaches down to the lowest low intertidal, so a zero tide, and eventually built a rock wall. After time, and through the addition of people adding sediment and sands and shells, that slope beach is going to level out to the height of the rock wall, just like the terraces we talked about on the slopes for cultivating plants. By leveling out that naturally sloped beach, you do a couple things. You can maximize that sweet spot where little neck clams and butter clams thrive by putting your wall at a particular height. Yeah. And you've also meant that at the lowest low tides, all those clams were only visible, for very few daylight hours. They're mostly underwater. But by changing the slope of the beach, you've also meant that beach is more available. More of that beach is available for more of the time because it's higher in the tide. So if you're following along with me, you would just take your forearm, which is sloped at the natural beach, and level it off. And then that becomes a new clam habitat. And folks did that, not just on already productive beaches or moderately productive beaches, but they actually built rock walls on bedrock and on boulder slopes. And so they took areas that had no clam habitat before, zero rocks, and put a wall on it, and then had sediment accumulated behind that wall to make this flat terrace. They're highly productive. And the ecologists in our team have figured out why they're so productive, and that they are so many more times productive than an on-wall beach, and allowing for people to create this sustainable food source, because it's just what I say, it's the place where clams get fat and happy. And it's just fabulous. And we now know that, when you go out during the low tides, you will see them from Alaska to probably Washington State. Anywhere the foreshore is not messed up and the conditions are right in terms of flow and the like. And then there's some places where people didn't build walls and we don't know why. That's some cultural reason, which makes it even cooler. But there's a lot of rock walls. And I was just doing a survey a week and a half ago during the low tides here on the small island where I live. And I thought there were no clam gardens. And I've been asking the community for 30 years, where are the clam gardens? Anyone found any clam gardens? No one's found any clam gardens. Well, all it took was me going out at the zero tides, and they were all over here. And it's just so exciting to see. So exciting to see, because they are, again, tangible evidence of all those intangible actions that make up the traditional marine management systems that supported people on the coast for millennia. They're awesome. They're fun. They're cool. And they're exposed for the by the low tide for only a 3-hour window for 5 days in each of May, June, July, and less than that in August. Otherwise, you have to excavate it or go visit them at night. But basically, they're submerged. So they're magical that way because you can't see the rock wall. So you're walking on this beach your whole life, and like I was with the islanders here, and they would say, look at that. I've been on this beach hundreds of times, and I've never noticed. So they're quite neat that way.
Yeah, that is definitely cool. I'd be thrilled to be walking along a beach and find a millennia-old structure that had been built there.
Yep.
Can you say a little bit about how long these clam gardens have been there and who built them and how you determined how old they are?
So again, people have been managing, cultivating clams in those various intangible ways from the beginning of time. That just would have been built into the way people interacted. But in the places we've worked, we have found that people have been building the rock walls for at least 4,000 years ago. And we actually published 3,500 in an earlier paper, our team, because we're being quite conservative with our methods. And we thought that people would go, oh my God, that's too old. It couldn't be. And so we were really, really conservative in our methods and our interpretations. But after we looked at it and said, why do we do that? And now we're doing another method of dating, which I'll tell you about in a sec. But we think, over 4,000 where we've worked, people started building these rock walls, which means rolling these rocks down to build that front terrace. I should tell you, by the way, that there's indigenous names for these. We're calling them clam gardens, but each group would have had their indigenous name, like the Kwakwakwa term, which Kwaksistala Wathla shared with us, is Lohiwe. That's the Kwakwala term means to roll, and it refers to roll the rocks down to the lowest tide part of the beach. And there's oral traditions about that, connecting that to the first people. So it's very cool. So because people are rolling these rocks down to the beach, there's two potential ways of dating them, or several actually, really, for archaeologists. But archaeologists, if you're using radiocarbon dating, which many people will know about, radiocarbon basically dates when a living thing died. So it doesn't help for dating rocks. However, rolling of the rocks down the slope or carrying the rocks down the slope did two things. Occasionally, people picked up a rock that had a barnacle on it. And if we were lucky enough, and they brought the rock down to the lowest intertidal and it landed in the muck face down so that barnacle is preserved, we can excavate it and then date that barnacle, i.e. when did it die? So that's perfect for us, and that tells us when that rock was put into place. Another way is that when they're rolling rocks, if there are any clams on the surface, they got a rock put on their head and they die as well. So if we can find these clams that are living at the time when the rock went on them, we can tell by their position, then we can date those. We can also date other things that might have gotten trapped, like wood and the like, but it's the barnacles and the trapped clams that are really the really wonderful surprises and treats when you're excavating. So remember, we have a 3-hour window to excavate. We're digging a trench in these rock walls, and I don't want the listeners to think about this like a beautiful straight rock wall. We're talking about a pile of rocks that line the intertidal zone along the beach. But it's a big pile, and it's not a pretty pile. And we have 3 hours to basically trench into the wall. So you're going madly. Someone's taking notes where you're just diving in, throwing rocks everywhere. You're covered from head to toe with sediment, looking to get far back enough into that rock pile to find these trapped clams or barnacles. And really, it's luck of the draw whether you find them in that 3-hour window. But we did. We found them. And we were able to date them as the time when that part of the wall was initiated. We also, our team, used something called optical stimulated luminescence, which is a very fancy thing that I barely understand in physics. But my colleague, Christine Neudorf, came out with us, and she basically stuck these cores down in the terraces. And she's looking at basically timing when the silica, the sand grains, last saw light. So they hold, when they are exposed to sunlight, the electrons in them get excited and they move around. And apparently you can trap that moment. It was covered over with dirt. So she was also able to date the clam gardens by figuring out when was that last moment that lowest sand, the natural sand level, was exposed to light. Awesomely cool. And then finally, what we're working out now in a paper we're just finishing is, which I'm most excited about, is that In places where you know the sea level history, you can actually date the walls by their heights. So let me explain that. There's very complicated sea level history since the Pleistocene, since the end of the Ice Age. In some places, sea level has been rising, depending on where they sit in the tectonic plates. In some places, it's been lowering. Well, in places where it's lowering, it's really lovely because we can say that, 14,000 years ago, sea level was higher. So if you want to look for old sites, you're going to look inland today, right? So old terrestrial sites, settlements or clam gardens or whatever. And sea level is just dropping through time. So if the readers can just imagine sea level dropping through time, and the sea is basically going further out, if you will, and older sites are left stranded high and dry. So that's true for old settlements, but it's also true for clam gardens. And my friend Keith Holmes did just this magical GIS on all the clam garden walls in Quadra Island, an island here in British Columbia, to get their exact height. And we then basically could use the height of these walls as a proxy measure for age. Because if a wall today, a garden today, is really sitting high up in the intertidal, too high for a clam habitat today, we know it has to be old, right? It was thriving at a time when the sea was higher and closer to that wall. So basically, when you do survey, you can see that these terraces are different heights and they're measures of time. The oldest ones today, way too high in the beach today to have clam habitat. And the youngest ones are right today at current tide level and they're low. So basically, through his GIS magic, we're able to measure the height of every wall in the study area. It's like 800 some odd wall lengths. And by knowing the sea level curve, which other of my colleagues have figured out, we can tell approximately how old these clam gardens are by how high they sit in the intertidal. So that means instead of having to excavate and go through that crazy time, through that 3-hour window and hope that you'll find some radiocarbon dates, we can actually date walls just by how high they are, where they're sitting in the intertidal. So the lowest ones on today's tide level will be the youngest, and the ones that are way high and up behind the beach, way too high for current clam habitat, have to be older. They have to be. So it's really amazing. It's a major breakthrough, and we're just in the middle of figuring that out, like now, today, this morning, and after I hang up.
So you have a newer paper that you sent along to our podcast producer, Eric Hoffner, which of course he passed along to me, but it looks like it's not published yet, right?
That one I sent to him. The most recent one is a kind of a summary paper for an edited volume that my friends are doing. So that's been accepted and it won't be out till the end of the month. But I sent it to you because I thought it was a good summary of all the different kinds of projects. And in it was written with my dear friend and co-conspirator, Anne Solomon, marine ecologist extraordinaire. So Anne and I and the rest of the people in the Clam Garden Network are this, amazing team because we have different strengths. But Anne's strength is marine ecology and experimental ecology. So when we understand now why clam gardens are so much more productive than non-wall beaches, we understand the amount of productivity in them and the like is because Anne's experimental work with clam gardens today. And then we took that knowledge and kind of extended it back in time with more details than I need to go into here. But the bottom line is that Anne and her team were able to show that, clam gardens are sometimes up to 4 times more productive than non-walled beaches, non-cultivated beaches without walls. And also she and her team and her wonderful student, Natasha Salter, were able to show the reasons for that productivity, the reasons elders were telling us that they were the best clams in their territory. And there's 2 main reasons. One is that they have higher levels of calcium carbonate from all that broken shell. So the shell hash, it increases clam survival, especially the young. You want to have young clams do well so they can grow up to be older clams. And the other really important thing, both of these are important for climate change today, is that they're really good. That terrace, that flattening of the terrace regulates the temperature of the water and the sediments on that beach so that beach is, and those sediments are less cold in the winter and less hot in the summer. So Anne talks about when she was diving during the low tide, during the heat domes last year, one of the many extreme climate events we're getting these days, she could feel, in her wetsuit, the difference in temperature. She swam over the clam garden. It was instantly cooler, which is what makes what clams want. So they don't want to be too cold, so then they moderate the temperature at the other time of the year. So she and her team were able to show these two incredible mechanisms for why clam gardens are so much more productive. And then when we look at the archaeological record, we don't have a way of figuring out, not as good a way of figuring out why, but it basically supports the idea that they're producing many, many more clams once clam gardens come into the picture, and sustainably. We see no evidence that clams are being depleted, despite the fact that human population is going up through time. And it's because of these mechanisms that Anne was able to demonstrate, Anne and her team.
Well, in that paper, you write that ultimately clam gardens are exemplars of how looking to the past can guide the future of resilient, equitable, and sovereign food systems amid changing ocean and socio-political conditions. Can you expand a bit on how studying these clam gardens from the past can help guide the future of sustainable food systems?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I was walking with my cousin who was visiting from LA yesterday, and he said, "So your work, it's cool. It's totally cool." Because everyone thinks archaeology is cool. But is there any other reason to be doing it? He said, "That's enough. But is there another reason?" I said, "Yeah, there's huge reasons." And they are those reasons that you mentioned. The first one that comes to mind is about just social justice and recognizing these are tangible evidence of people's connections to the land and the sea in the past. And that plays out hugely in terms of respecting Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. It plays out in the courts in terms of rights and title. It plays out in so many ways. It is, we all say in the Clam Garden Network that, and I encourage the readers to look up our just out, it'll be out in 3 days, our brand new website on clam gardens, that we really talk about the magic of clam gardens, and that they're not like sensitive sites like a burial site, yet they carry this magic that enables people to see the past, understand the past, and understand and have respect for people's relationships to the land and sea. So that's one aspect of the kind of why it's important to study these features. Another is that through our team's work, we're able to show that they are a sustainable food source. Despite very, very high populations of Indigenous peoples in the past, they were able to sustain that harvest. And we see from the archaeological record, there's no evidence of, sizes getting smaller of clams through time or being depleted or people having to switch to other resources. Rather, there's stability throughout the life of the clam garden use. So 4,000 years, the time that we can measure. So thinking going forward, of course, where we're seeking ways to sustainably feed people, but not just feed their stomachs, but feed their souls. And you think of for Indigenous people, clams have been what we call a cultural keystone species. They've been central to their lives, their emotional, their physical, and their spiritual lives for millennia. So when we think of food security and food sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, we think about the rights, the ability to be able to harvest safely and sustainably these traditional foods that feed into, if you will, all those aspects of the traditional management system, like I said, that include the emotional as well as the physical. And then there's there's damn climate change. The climate crisis, which are warming our oceans, making them more acid, and just affecting our food everywhere. It looks like, Anne's team is able to show that clams are able to withstand those temperature extremes that we're increasingly facing. So if you combine that with the structure of the clam garden with the traditional knowledge about how and when to harvest, you're looking at a sustainable food source during times of climate change that is both socially just and nutritious. And it's empowering. I think it's empowering for settlers and Indigenous people alike to have an age-old cultivation system to support it. And it's really for those reasons that Indigenous people up and down the coast have started their own clam garden restoration projects. And there's some just unbelievably groundbreaking and inspiring projects that are all community-led. They're focused on clam gardens and the rebuilding of clam gardens with youth and tracking the abundance of clams once clam gardens have been rebuilt and refurbished and tilled and cleaned. And it's, to be honest, the most inspiring movement that I've been part of in my entire career. I'm just so privileged to witness it. Just really, we're all, I think, carrying around a sadness with us. These days, it's always at the edge of our vision. And for me, this is a shining light. So that's nice.
So you said there's a clam gardening movement that's taking off right now? I spoke with Dune Lankard of the Native Conservancy about kelp aquaculture projects on an episode of the podcast a few months ago, but I was unaware of the growing clam gardening movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so that's, again, just the magic of clam gardens, because, again, they're not sensitive sites and that they're not, like I said, they're not burial sites or rock art sites. People have been digging in clam beaches forever. And so to rebuild and reconnect and rehabilitate clam gardens is really just such a culturally appropriate thing to do for all the reasons we mentioned in terms of food security and sovereignty and rights and title and the like. So there are several and a growing number of First Nations and Native Americans from Alaska to Washington who are engaging in their own way in clam garden rehabilitation, reconnection projects. And they're different, like the Swinomish in Washington State. I'm just in awe of them. They didn't find an ancient clam garden, but they went through this amazing community process to find a beach that would be suitable to create one and to cultivate. And it's just this unbelievable community initiative. The Hunkaminam and Wasanich in the Gulf Islands here have kind of led the way in clam garden restoration projects, they were partnered with Parks Canada and several researchers, but they have led the way, community-led project on restoring, reconnecting clam gardens. So there's several things involved, like just in the mechanics, to do it. And different groups, like I said, are doing differently. A group up north, different again. But you need to rebuild the rock wall. And if the sea level has changed, like it has in the Gulf Islands, you need to, where it's gotten higher, you need to build up the wall. In places like, in other places, if the sea level has gone down, you need to knock down the wall. But you need to till it. You need to clear the beaches. Like several elders go onto the beaches today and say this beach needs cleaning. Like it's being suffocated by all these seaweeds, by sea lettuce. And, you need to move the rocks because it creates more habitat and it aerates the soil. And if there's any gardeners out there, this will all make sense to you. It's the same thing, in the foreshores it would be in your garden. So these communities are taking their local knowledge of how to cultivate clams. They're embracing the fact that clam beaches are places of learning and sharing intergenerationally with elders and youth. And they're, like as I said, reconnecting, rebuilding the clam garden and connections to those clam gardens in their own ways. And it's so powerfully inspiring and humbling.
So what's this new website you mentioned earlier that people will be able to find out more about clam gardens at?
The www.clamgarden.com.
Yeah, what will people find there?
So as part of this kind of movement, like the Clam Garden Network has become a thing on the coast here. And we got some money of people who are interested in clam gardens. We were just an email group and we'd send out interesting things about clams and clam gardens to this group. But we got some money to run a webinar series. And of course, we got the money in March 2020. So yeah, you can imagine what happened. And I had kind of planned all these hotel rooms and, I was going to bring in Indigenous peoples from up and down the coast. We got money it was going to be fabulous for a 3-day workshop. But then we, like the rest of the world, pivoted and we created a webinar series, which was so much better. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Because it would have been 3 days of just a select people from up and down the coast. And so instead we had an 8-part series, a webinar series that was really slow and appropriate pace. Each webinar was co-led by Indigenous community and a Western scientist about various topics like governance, rights and title, food security, archaeology, ecology, all these different things. And they were attended by hundreds of people up and down the coast from all over, like, we would go as far as Hawaii and in the middle of Canada and the US. It was very cool. And we had a website, and it's amazing how quickly websites get out of date in their look, because I've helped design quite a few, and boy, you think you're done. But our, 5-year-old or 8-year-old website looked really old, and the data were really out of date because we've learned so much since we originally did this. So the Clam Garden Network revised our website, and it's basically structured on the webinar series, which was the kinds of things that people wanted to hear about, like governance, like rights and title, like ecology in the past, like ecology in today, with lots of pretty pictures. And they really explain how clam gardens work and why they're so magical. So www.clamgarden.com, I think it's singular. I think you'll be able to find it. And, the network is really such a powerful thing. And we had have so much interest up and down the coast. But we're actually trying to keep it community-based. So we're at a point now, we're just getting grants to try to figure out what is the best way to have an Indigenous and community-led network where researchers from settler and non-settler communities, Indigenous peoples, and different peoples, managers can come together around clam gardens. And so who leads this show, and how do we do this in a kind of acephalous way that really is productive? So that's where we're at now, is really trying to think about different models for promoting the Clam Garden Network and all the wonderfulness of clam gardens and clam cultivation in the past and hopefully into the future.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us with offsetting production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Manga Bay Newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay, or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @mangabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.